Ark, and well met, folks. My name is RuneMeisterKris. Welcome back to another Archaeology brunch session. Today, we are talking about drones in archaeology. That's right. We are going to talk about the practical and various applications of using small UAVs, unmanned air vehicles, in the field of archaeology, which is something that, I'm personally very interested in. I think it's super cool, super neat, and a field that has definitely popped off in like the last 3 to 5 years, for sure. I am really interested in taking a look at different types of surface scans to determine artifact and site locations, looking at thermal scanning, but photogrammetry and 3D modeling are big ones. That's definitely a super cool application. So I have a couple articles pulled up that I kind of want to go through today. I think that it's going to give us a pretty good idea of what drones can do for the field of cultural heritage. Hey everybody, thanks for tuning into the video. Before we get started, I'm gonna have to do that mandatory subscribe plug. So if you could go ahead and hit the button, it would be greatly appreciated. Every little bit of support helps the channel grow and allows me to make more top quality content. And that's what we're here for, isn't it? So subscribe. So this right here is just a drone archaeology website. This is a website specifically catered towards the use of drones within the field of archaeology. And this I brought up because it kind of gives an overview of all the different ways that we can use drones, right? So you use them primarily as aerial survey devices. You can take a look at an area where you think that there's going to be sites. You do a drone fly over to see whether or not any surface finds in terms of structures or ruins or anything like that are visible. You can get a completely different idea of your landscape from the air than you can from ground level. And sometimes it's important to do ground level surveys. It lets you pick out more finer details, smaller artifacts, things like that. But getting an aerial look is great for determining different types of landscape and topography features, Stuff that looks a little bit different in the air could give an indication of sites and places that you wouldn't have seen if you were walking on the ground. In a similar vein, there is Lidar and IR scanning, that is to say light detection and ranging and infrared. This is a similar vein, right? It still involves getting aerial shots, overview shots, but this looks at the ground using different wavelengths of light. And the idea there is that you can penetrate through some of the surface layers of the soil to get to places underneath, and you can check out where the heat signatures of the ground are giving off more or less heat, which can indicate subsurface conditions, things which might be more conducive to holding artifacts or old structures that you wouldn't be able to tell just from a plain photograph survey. They also discuss here artificial intelligence, machine learning, basically like utilizing these types of technologies to better analyze and assess and utilize drones and photogrammetry and LiDAR and all that stuff. 3D modeling and 3D printing, again, two things that I have a very little self-taught experience with, but a big interest in. And this really kind of stems down to taking the photographs and the images that you have used and the scans and surveys and kind of using them to recreate digitally the site that you're looking at, and then ultimately print it out so that you have a tangible little side thing there that you can hold and look at and judge on different circumstances. It's so cool. It's crazy cool. I wish I had a 3D printer. They're just so expensive, and I don't know if I would use it enough. No, who am I kidding? Between this work and D&D, I would absolutely use my 3D printer if I had one. GIS and documentation. For those of you who don't know, GIS is the system by which you use like mapping for projects. So not just archaeological projects, but also like major infrastructure projects all utilize GIS to determine their maps and everything like that. Next up are Rovs and Rovers, which are basically just like a different type of drone. It's like ground drones or underwater drones. They're cool things that allow you to do marine archaeology. Not exactly my forte or my area of expertise, but still very cool. Site protection is the primary purpose of cultural heritage to begin with. So all of these things can help not just protect the site in terms of socially, like saying, oh, this is an important place, we should protect this, but also, as it says here, looking at the landscape to determine better ways to protect the site from natural causes as well. And then finally, animation in VR, another area of big interest for me. I've talked before, I think, about this site that they had in York, England. It was at the Viking Museum in York, and they basically had this program there for a little while that was a fully realized like AR augmented reality render of a Viking like port market. And when you walked into the room, they gave you like an AR headset, like cheap Samsung phones on like their Samsung VR. And you could walk around the room, and as you walked around and looked around, the market was bustling all around you. And you could come up to specific artifacts that they had pinned out, and you could like pick them up and look at them in VR to be like, and basically like they only let certain numbers of people in the room at a time so that you weren't slamming into each other. But yeah, you would walk into the room and you would like pick up these artifacts and look at them, and they would give you all the details about these artifacts. It was one of the coolest concepts of utilizing VR and AR within an archaeological context that I have heard of, and I would love to do it. I would love to work on something like that. Using drones in archaeology is an amazing concept and it's great in practice, but the problem is because of, you know, various flight laws, understandable flight laws, you're going to have airspace restrictions, you're going to have legal rules that you have to follow because it is still an aircraft, right? So you have to follow aircraft laws, especially like, you know, the United States. You got to make sure that there's no other things flying around, you got to know warnings, you got to know airspaces, you know, stuff like that to make sure that you have all of the correct permissions and permits to do what you're doing. So there is like a certification element to it, which I don't have yet because it is time and money. So looking at drone mapping and what it does in terms of like on the very base level, like what are the most straightforward uses for drones that we're seeing in cultural heritage right now? This article is from January of this year, the end of January. Drone mapping discovers priority archaeological sites at Doganella. Doganella is a area just outside of Rome, in Italy. And what they did was they basically mapped out a large archaeological site and used different methods to kind of look through and see what they were doing, right? So they took a total of, 15,000 images over 20 flights within an area that was roughly 1,730 acres. Right? The drone that they used was the EBX, which, for context, there's a picture of it in the thing, but it looks like this. It looks like a freaking stealth fighter. It's a really neat drone. But it's absolutely one of the more scientifically inclined drones, which you need to have because look, it has its accuracy down to 1.5 centimeters, which is insane. Typically, in terms of an archaeological concept, when you're looking at accuracy for your data, you need sub-meter accuracy, meaning that everything has to be within 1 meter to be considered like, accurate and good in terms of an archaeological survey. Finding something within 1.5 centimeters, insane. So this is a picture of the site that they had at Doganella, and it was basically just a farm field, but they found a pre-Roman Etruscan colony in this area. What they were doing was basically looking through this farm field to figure out where exactly these archaeological sites were, where the remains are, where everything could be pinpointed down to. And now this here is one of the survey result images from what they did. The color, I believe, is meant to indicate terrain, like the elevation of the terrain. This was using multispectral mapping, which basically uses a 5-band multispectral sensor, and it classifies the landscape using infrared and Ndvi to identify archaeological features related to the percentage of humidity, vegetation, and crop growth. So one thing of particular note I want to point out is like this straight line right here. You can see there's a bit of a straight line coming in this direction, at least in this part right here. Because what this does is this brings back here where they have taken out the thermal element and they're just kind of showing a landscape. These dotted lines here indicate locations of Etruscan walls. And so this spot right here where this wall was coming out corresponds with this straight line right here. So the wall kind of undulated down around this way as it did right here. So those are the sort of things that I would be on the lookout for if I'm looking at these sorts of images, like things that are unusually straight. Obviously they have the more modern present farm roads and everything, and then the structures and the housings and the developments and everything around. And then there are the indications of everything that are hiding underneath the surface. And that's kind of the whole point of this stuff, right? Utilizing these drones is really very much for the purpose of trying to find clues and things that you can't necessarily see on the surface level survey. of walking on the ground. When you're walking out here, you can look and you can go, oh yeah, I mean, I could see some modern developments of straight lines and crop growth and all of that. Little, the little road probably cutting across right there. But looking for a lot of these subsurface features can be tough when you're on the surface. Normally we utilize that by digging shovel tests or something like that, but you can't exactly go out and shovel test 1,700 acres, was it? Yeah, shovel testing 1,700 acres takes a long time. A long time. So, I mean, utilizing these drones to kind of help identify this stuff can be a time saver, certainly, even though it can sometimes be super pricey. And then looking again, we've got more images that kind of show areas of like density. So the darker purple areas are mounds, meaning areas where the soil has been kind of like piled up and clumped. You can see it a lot kind of through here. And then obviously down there, those are probably roads. And so looking at this, you could see the outline of where things were organized. And then down in this image specifically, you could see where the dark purple clumps up. These were the remains of structures, right? And these structures coincide with these lines. I don't know if you could tell, they're kind of faint, but there's like these kind of yellowish green lines that are running through, and those are the overlays of where the streets would have been for this settlement. And they kind of coincide. You see here, this is like a major corner with the 3 big structures laid out right there. And then you've got, like yards and stuff in between with a couple more structures lined up in all of these areas. And looking through these images, this is the Ndvi. I don't remember what the acronym itself specifically stands for because I haven't worked with Ndvi before. But it is in the same band as infrared, which also coincides with artifact locations, So looking at these spots where the soil looks particularly dense, where the ground surface is dense, also lines up with densest areas of artifact scatter, which include tile and pottery fragments. Oh god, I just realized I haven't been eating my brunch. That's half the point of this stream, is the brunch. So I'll be scattering in the bites here and there. Don't mind me. In addition to the drone and all of that imagery, they also used various other methods to kind of help pinpoint and identify where the stuff is. And then, of course, tying in with some other clues that come about. Because this is the thing, right? There's not one... Using just one method of identifying cultural remains and looking for these things, you can potentially get the answer there. But the best way to do it is to utilize a bunch of different options. I think next week, one of the things I'm going to look at in terms of the archaeology bunch stream, I think next week I'm going to do a thing on background research, looking at like historic maps and atlases, which is something that I did a lot when I was getting ready to go out on a site, or even in lieu of going out on a site, because you can identify things a lot that way. So I'm going to take a look at some of those websites. But looking at these types of things can give you a big indication. So here we have this area of the project right here, kind of ripped out of the imagery right here. So you can see it very faintly here. There's like that little white spot just above my cursor right there. That kind of coincides with this little area here that they're indicating, and that was an old structure location along this old farm, and now they have this farm road here that's present in the modern era, and then these roads and everything that are kind of going around. But one of the cool indications that they had here is that the modern orientation of the farm fields and the roads and everything like that is slightly off kilter from what it used to be. The site used to have it used to be like kind of turned a little bit, and now since that time period, they have now readjusted where the ground surface is. So taking a look, and that can kind of help clue you into where other things might be, because you're going to be able to readjust how the site looks and where they would have oriented everything. Sometimes you can use modern roads and modern orientations to give yourself an indication of what the area would look like, because a lot of times, especially in the more recent past, it's the same. So if you find a structure along a road in this one location, you're going to say, okay, well, if I follow the road in that location, maybe I'll find more stuff because it's along this road. Plus, a large number of modern roads are built on existing historic and further back roads, But yeah, that's kind of a general basic overview of like what the most common uses of drones are, right? For kind of surveying the area, look at a site, getting some ideas of what it looks like from from an infrared, a lidar, topographic view, and kind of pinpointing where some features and artifacts and sites may be within this landscape. Next up, from science.org, aerial drones reveal hidden archaeology. Unmanned flying craft point scientists towards Secrets of Buried Communities, an article from 2014 by Lizzie Wade. This is an old article that shows some of the earlier elements of what archaeology was doing. And it's kind of just like this is just kind of the basic general overview of like the hopes and expectations that people had for archaeology when drones first started coming into play. And it kind of covers a lot of the things that we've talked about already, where it discusses thermal cameras, being able to look under the ground surface without having to dig there from the initial standpoint. A lot of people might recognize hearing about thermal imaging in a cool archaeological context because of its utilization with both Egyptian and South American contexts. Utilizing thermal imagery can let you see things that you wouldn't be able to normally. In South America, multiple Mayan, Incan, and Aztec sites have been identified by using aerial and thermal imagery to cut through the surface layer of the jungles, right? The treetops, the canopies, things that you wouldn't be able to see with like a regular plane aerial flyover. You can see using satellite imagery, drone imagery, thermal imagery, penetrate through those upper levels and see the ground surface beneath these canopies, right? And they have identified ruins of structures and settlements that used to be in these different locations as a result of that, which is crazy cool. And so utilizing drones for that sort of purpose was kind of one of the initial and big ones. They also did this in Egypt, where they were able to use thermal imagery, LiDAR, and satellite imagery to penetrate through the upper levels of sand and help them identify the fact that way more of the Nile was populated than they previously thought. Like settlement across the Nile, which isn't surprising given how many thousands of years the Egyptian Empire ran. But settlement along the Nile was, over the course of its entire lifespan, like universal. Like I very much doubt that there were many places along the Nile River that were not populated at one point or another. Now, not to say that the entire Nile was just one giant megalopolis over the course of Egyptian history, but I think that people were moving up and down it and living alongside it, and I would very much say that like the vast majority of the Nile River was populated within the Egyptian Empire. But yeah, looking at utilizing these drones, and you know, at this point they were still pretty short. You know, you have like 15-minute drone flights, which admittedly, like, you know, my drone, I think, you know, I have the Mavic Mini, right, first gen Mavic Mini, and they go for a decent amount of time, more than 11 to 15 minutes, but less than an hour. I want to say it's like 30 to 45 minutes worth of flight time with it, which is not a tremendous amount of time. It's a decent amount of time for doing surveys and stuff, especially because it saves you so much time compared to walking. If you're trying to do a survey of like a solar panel field, right? As opposed to taking half the day to walk back and forth and pedestrian survey the entire solar panel field, you can utilize a drone in about half an hour to kind of get a good aerial overview. Like I said, you're going to miss out on some things, right? It depends on the type of survey that you're looking for and what the state is looking for and what the company that you're working for is looking for. Because that pedestrian survey will help you identify small artifacts, you know, things like projectile points or pottery fragments, whereas the drone survey will be great for identifying big overlaying sites, you know, things like structures or settlements or landscape divergences that you're not going to be able to pick up on ground surface. And it can definitely save you a lot of time by doing it very quickly. But obviously, the longer and longer that drones are able to utilize their battery life, that means that the bigger areas that we're able to survey in quicker amounts of time without having to take charge breaks, which is just going to make things easier and quicker and better in the long run. Next up, from a website called The Drone Girl, which obviously this website is more towards drones as opposed to archaeology, which can be useful and helpful in terms of looking at the types of stuff that you're working with, you know, because you want to get both perspectives. This is a very interdisciplinary science, right? Using drones in archaeology, it's not like drones were built to be used in archaeology. Drones have utilizations in many different contexts. So by looking at people who specialize in those other fields, we can learn how to better utilize drones in archaeology, because we can see the types of things that they're working on, the stuff that they're doing, and ponder how we can take that, spin it, and stick it into our field, right? It's always super important to look at our peers, look at our coworkers, look at the people around us, how they're utilizing the same sorts of stuff that we're using so that we can figure out better ways to use it, because they might be encountering problems that we haven't seen yet, and some of them might be problems that we're never going to run into. or they might be major problems that we are definitely going to run into someday that we'll need to have a fix for. And so in this case, this is just discussing on a website that is typically for drones in general. It was a guest post written by Mr. Peter Leslie, director of Skycam, a drone inspection company based in Edinburgh, Scotland. And the discussions here talk about the different uses of drones in archaeology and the different methods of doing it. They talk about how drones have enabled archaeologists and historians to collect data faster than ever before. In general, groundwork surveying can be reduced from 2 to 3 weeks to 1 to 4 days. This is something that we were just talking about how pedestrian surveying of a large field can take way more time than it would if we were using drones. That's, I think, fairly obvious. That's kind of like the key element of it, but seeing the numbers of saying like 2 to 3 weeks worth of work reduced to less than 1 week is a huge difference. It can also help with documenting and recording new discoveries, assisting in planning future dig sites, assessing damage to ancient sites from natural disasters or human activity, monitoring illegal excavation, looting of artifacts, and assisting in digital reconstruction of ancient sites. These are all kind of talking points that were on that first website, that archaeology drone website that we were looking at. And they're not wrong. I think that, and now I know that the idea of like monitoring illegal excavation and looting artifacts, that's kind of hard. That's kind of, I feel like I mean, yeah, that is a thing. Like, I think they probably mentioned that in the sense that like one time they were flying over and they saw people looting a site and were like, hey, you kids, get out of here. Like, it's, I don't think that's really a thing that's going to be done all the time. Like, they're not going to schedule drone flyovers of archaeological sites. Maybe at some of like the most important ones that are frequently looted. But I think that the time and expense and the effort that would go into that is too much. I could be wrong, but that would be my thought on it. For me personally, the big interest that I have is this last point here. Assisting in digital reconstruction of ancient sites. And this again ties into what we were talking about using 3D models to take these sites that we are finding and create like a printable, tangible version of it. Photogrammetry is the big method of that. Now, photogrammetry in terms of like its method is basically getting a 3D model of something. It's taking enough photographs of something from enough different angles that you're able to mesh them together, mold them around the features of whatever you're photographing, and ensure that you are creating a 3D model, a 3D render of what you're working on. I've done a little bit of photogrammetry in my spare time. You can do it with your cell phone. You can just take a whole bunch of photos of something from a bunch of different angles with really good lighting, and then you can take that, put it into certain programs, and what it'll do is it'll compile all of those images that you've collected. Obviously, the more, the better. Compile all of those images, overlay them with each other, and create a 3D model of what it is you're looking at. That's something that you can spin around, look at from all angles, and ultimately 3D print. You have the printer for it. I haven't flown my drone in a very long time, mostly because I've been working so much, I've been moving a whole lot, and I've been working on, streaming and all this elements of it. And I think that there's probably going to be a Sunday where I try and drag us all out and do like an IRL stream of us trying to fly this drone around. Because I think that we can kind of do some practical archaeology of looking at how this drone flies over an area, the things that it sees, what that might trigger in terms of looking at it from an archaeological standpoint. Some very cool elements and ideas and stuff that we could take a look at. And then finally, Lidar mapping, which this looks a lot like the map that we were looking at from our initial, from the first article that we looked at. You could see the topography and the elevation as it's kind of rising up here. And in this one, it looks like the red is indicating some of the highest points, with the greens being the lower points. Lidar, in terms of its definition, is a surveying technology that measures distances using lasers. So Lidar requires a very specific type of camera and device on the drone. We're not going to be able to do Lidar testing with our drone because our drone just has a camera on it. We're not going to be able to do laser guided radar testing. The Lidar camera costs $35,000. Not exactly in my budget right now. What Lidar mapping can do specifically for the field of archaeology: provide high levels of detail, obviously, because it can pinpoint using the lasers a lot of different identifying points. It can be used to create 3D models, very similar to photogrammetry. I mean, this is already a pretty good 3D render on a 2D image. If you were to take this picture and turn it on its side, you would then get the elevations on a graph, right? It would still be a 2D image of like a graph showing the elevation points of where all the things were as much as they dip and jump, right? And between those two, you'll be able to create a pretty decent 3D image of what it is that you're looking at. Additional advantages of LiDAR include it was unaffected by weather circumstances such as cloud cover, both of which can hamper airborne data. And then here, this is what we were just talking about. Surveyors can remove foliage and trees from the models to get a clear glimpse of what lies beneath. That's the big use of it right now, using LiDAR to kind of get rid of some of these blockages. So the last thing that I have is an article that I have downloaded, which is examples and results of aerial photogrammetry and archaeology with unmanned air vehicles, UAVs. Geometric documentation, high resolution, multispectral analysis, models, and 3D printing. Again, this article is very lengthy, and I will try to, I'll link to where the article was, so that if anyone else wants to download it, it'll be in the Discord. These are just some basic aerial imageries of places in Italy. Obviously, they do look at a whole bunch of different places to identify some of this stuff. I need more coffee. Yeah, so these are some aerial images of places in Italy that you can look at, and now, again, aerial images helping to identify some mounds, which obviously people are probably already aware of. But I want to get down to the part which I find the coolest. These are examples of some of the drones. Now, see, that's the thing, because in that last one, we had guys with this huge wingspan drone, right? These massive things. And you might think that you need some of the big chongos. You know, they have DJI Phantoms on their list of aircraft that they were using in various things. And Phantoms can get pretty big. You know, they're like around. They're like that. But their most recent one, they used the DJI Mini 2. And I've got the DJI Mini 1, you know? So you don't need the big cameras in order to get that data. You can do the job with some of these smaller, more accessible models. You can do it with one of your own little personal stuff, or at least get some great images that you can work with. This right here just kind of shows different, different image filter. Different image filters and how they're used. So up here you just have color images of the areas that they're looking at. Underneath, I don't think these are all of the same area, because obviously some of these things look very different, but these are utilizing different types of stuff. So we have, you know, we have thermal, we have like more, I don't know if they're LiDAR exactly, but we definitely have images that are tuned up to look for different things. Let's get down to the part that I wanted to show you guys here. These images, this and this, are 3D recreations of sites using the photographs that they took. This right here is a 3D model render, digitally recreated, of what the site looks like. And now you can tell that there is some, like, you know, graphical errors, like it's a bit smudged over here, and there's, like, you know, a little bit more smoothness to the texture in a lot of places. But you can tell so much about this site, this area, and what it might have looked like based on these images. And this is kind of like the 3D overlay within the program, or the photograph overlay within the program. You know, these things are indicating where the landform was, where the disturbances are, where these rock walls are. And you can look at this stuff, and this gives a completely different scope, scale, and understanding of the archaeological site compared to just looking at an overview picture like this. So you could be like, oh yeah, you know, I could see where some of the features are, I can see some of those things. And then looking at these kinds of 3D recreations, you can say, oh, okay, I see how this now looks in terms of the landscape. I can see how this looks on two different spectrums, right? I talked earlier about how ground surface surveys and aerial surface surveys are going to basically try and look for different, like they're looking for the same thing, but they're kind of doing it in different ways. I think that there's a great benefit to doing both. I know that that's very time consuming, and I know that you don't necessarily, I think that if you're using both, you don't need to be as in-depth with the ground surface element. But looking at a site from this perspective is completely different than looking at it from this perspective. You're looking for different things, you're seeing different things, you're identifying different things. And looking at them combined and being able to do it digitally with only one step can save you a lot. If you're able to get an aerial photograph of the area and you can look at it and say, oh, okay, I'm seeing the layout of all the different structures and lands and everything here. And then also being able to zoom down and be like, oh, okay, and now I see how this is utilized from a first-person standpoint, how people who are actually constructing these things would look at the area around to determine where they're going to put these structures. And that's kind of like the whole point of what they're doing. They're looking at it from a standpoint of like, oh, this is how it's done. I see. This is why they did it this way. So here, once again, we are looking at alternate types of imagery. This one here uses NIRGB image, which is another NVDI index. which is down here. We looked at those in that first article. And looking at it here, you could see the overlays of, well, yeah, I mean, the ground looks a little bit different. It looks a little bit more dense in these areas here. These little curved elements here were manually constructed compared to the natural ground surface around it. And that can help identify where structures and other features were in the landscape. These types of images overlaid with each other can help create a whole different spectrum of what you're looking at. But yeah, looking at this standard picture, you can see the outline of where some of these structures were in like some pretty dense pockets. Here, you can see this. You can even see this back end structure and this little side structure, which are barely, if at all, visible on the standard RGB image. This is the last bit. The 3D printing of archaeological sites. Man, so you have this structure right here. This, by the way, is a 3D image. This is not a photograph. This is a digitally reconstructed image of the site. So what they did was they then created it within the program, again, identifying the different levels of everything, and they were able to print it out into a physical object that they could look at and get an idea of, like, look at the detail on some of these rocks. These are some of the things that they were able to print to have the site as an example. I'm looking at this from a standpoint of education and outreach. If you have something like this in a classroom and you're trying to help show your students what type of thing you're looking at, we just went through a lot of the different details, looking at the aerial top-down, the ground surface overview of an area, and then there's third. There's a very tactile response to looking at this 3D printed image. Inspect it, look in at things that you want to know specifically. Now, I know it's not color accurate, but that's, you know, that's something else. Using all of your senses as a human being, evolutionarily, using more of your senses will give you more data. So if you cannot go to this site, if you cannot be there, this is a site in Italy. If we print it out and bring it to Americans, you can have that same sort of understanding of the site without needing to be in the location. And so that's, I think, kind of what's so important about this. There's so many cool things that are going on in the field of archaeology from a technological standpoint. You know, part of the reason I made this video was because of the FOMO, and I want to make sure that I'm like keeping up on it. But this is one of the big interest areas for me personally, and I'd love to try and work more with this stuff. And so I'm sure at some point in the future, I'm going to try and get some stuff together and see if we can do some photogrammetry, because I have done it before. I have created 3D models before of artifacts. So I think that trying to go through and do some photogrammetry of stuff would be super neat. But yeah, as far as what we were looking at today with drones, there's one last thing that I want to do, and this might go horribly. All right, I'm going to pull up the drone that I have, and I'm going to see if I can hover it so you guys can see. For those of you who are super unfamiliar with drones, I have my little guy here. So you can see it's a very small little dude. It's not a very big drone, but it does do the thing. It's going to be very dumb, but I'm excited. He sang a little song when he turned on. Do-do-do. 1.2 meters. How tall is 1.2 meters? Let's find out. Oh. Let's go. This is my little buddy. So he's now recording. Everybody say hi to Hugin. All right, let me back him up. Now here's going to be the fun part. Let's see if I can... Okay. Okay. Land, please God, don't break anything. We did it! Yes! Poggers! Poggers! All right, everybody, that was our good buddy Hugin. Yay! Round of applause for Hugin. Yay! What a good little buddy! What a good little buddy! Yay! Oh, that's so nice. That's so nice, little friend. Yay! Okay, turn him on. Go to sleep, go to sleep, go to sleep, go to sleep.